time, what we had finished with was abstract expression, which most scholars, most art historians that study 20th century art, they think of abstract expression as really belonging to those earlier styles we looked at. The styles of surrealism and Dada. And when they think about art that developed after that point, they see that as being art that is different. I noticed in your textbook that chapter 22 of your textbook starts out talking about abstract expression. So your textbook is treating it a little bit differently than I do, because they are connecting it with all this later art that's produced. But most scholars don't see it that way. So the way that I have developed this lecture is to talk about styles that develop after abstract expression. And it is a good way of starting because a number of artists that come after the abstract expressionists are really criticizing them and are trying to develop something different from the abstract expressionists. The first style that I want to talk about is Neo-Dada, and it has a number of people that are associated with it. I've listed here just the musicians and the poets that are associated with it. This group of artists, writers that belong to this Neo-Dada movement are part of what was called the Beat generation. They were the generation of the 1950s. They were often called beatniks, sort of like your early form of hippies. And they looked at a lot of what was happening in the culture after World War II, and they felt that the culture was becoming very materialistic. It was becoming, very consumer-oriented. And they sort of felt like, something was being lost. It was almost like our soul or spirit was being lost in the culture at this time. And so a number of writers began to write poetry. Jack Kerouac is very well known for a series of poems that he created called On the Road. Allen Ginsberg is another poet and writer. He's probably the best known of the writers that belong to this generation. And as far as the musicians, there are a whole group of jazz musicians, Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie, that belong to this generation, and a composer named John Cage. And John Cage was very important not only to music, but also to the visual artists, because he taught at a school in North Carolina called Black Mountain College. And at this school, not only musicians, but many of the artists that we're going to look at for this Neo-Dada style attended college there at one point or another. And he talked about really doing different things in art. He talked about defocusing the viewer, the listener, making them not just concentrate on one particular message, but sort of asking them to sort of open up their life and look at art in relationship to what they knew and how they felt about life. And so his ideas will be important. He also talked about art of daily life, just using daily life as a source of ideas for art. And so he influenced a number of the visual artists that began to develop art. One of the styles that is a part of the sort of the broad style called Neo-Dada is what's called a happening. And happenings developed in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And what a happening was, it was a very spontaneous, uncontrolled, improvisational sort of visual event that would occur. Jazz has a lot of improvisation in it as well, and so there's that connection between jazz and the visual arts. And the man that is usually given credit for developing happenings is a man named Alan Kaprow. And this is one of the happenings that he took part in, that he sort of organized. You have to be careful. They're not really organized, but he sort of set the date and said, we're going to have this happening on this date, at this place. Everyone was invited to come. And so here you see the large group of people that came out to this place in New York, Ithaca, New York. And they found, just a lot of different kinds of junk stuff at this place. He had chosen it because there were all these different sort of items and pieces of junk. And then the idea was, don't really tell the people what to do in this event. Let them improvise. Let them figure out, how am I going to relate to this junk? What am I going to do with this junk? And, just let yourself free. Don't say it has to be controlled, it has to be organized, it has to have some concept really involved in it. And so we see people doing all sorts of things. Some people constructed sort of sculptural images out of junk, like you're seeing here, the people climbing up in the tree and on, this pile of junk here. There was an old car that was at the site, and so someone came up with the idea, let's pour jelly on the car. And then other people came up, and using their tongues, they created these sorts of designs in the car. And so, it was just an uncontrolled, spontaneous sort of thing that happened. It has connections with abstract expression. Because if you think about, if you think of the people, if you could look at them aerially, if you could see them from the air, and you would see all these people just sort of moving around in this area, it's sort of like those drip paintings that Pollock created, where they just sort of meandered around all over the canvas. There didn't seem to be any focal point, didn't seem to be, any meaning to it. Well, it was the same sort of thing with the happenings. And so this was, first of all, sort of their way of making abstract expression three-dimensional, but then also taking it out of something that would be thought of as fine art. A lot of artists, beginning with the neo-Dadists, begin to question what had been done in the past. They felt like the abstract expressionists were just too involved in thinking about high art. And they were too involved in expressing their personal sort of feelings in art. And these artists said, there's a lot more going on in life than just personal expression or thinking about great thoughts, about art. And so they reacted in that way against the abstract expressionists. One critic at the time said of the abstract expressionists that they were too neurotic. They were so preoccupied with their feelings and expressing their feelings in art. And this group of artists, began to say, it doesn't have to be that. Art can be other things as well. It can be about daily life. It can be made of daily kinds of objects. And so happenings was one of the first things that began to develop in the late 50s and into the 60s. A number of artists participated in them. This is an artist named Klaus Oldenburg that we're going to look at for sculpture. He went through a period of time performing happenings, and a number of these other artists that we're going to talk about also performed happenings. And the happenings were always very personal sorts of things, and they really let anyone that participated in them make up what they thought the happenings were about. It wasn't about one statement or one purpose to the happenings. Each person brought their own things to the happenings. One of the artists that is called a neo-Dada artist sometimes, although he makes sculptural images and he actually creates dioramas, three-dimensional dioramas, not little things like you sometimes see made for railroads, miniature railroads, things like that. These were full-scale dioramas, and because they occupy space, he's often called an environmental artist, meaning that he's actually used the space, surrounding objects as a part of his compositions. His father was a butcher, and so he seems in this, he was a Yiddish butcher in New York. And so what George Siegel seems to be doing here with this particular work is really calling back, thinking back to the way, the experiences and the sights that he saw in his father's butcher shop, and presenting them to us. And, the abstract expressionists hated this kind of art because, they said to themselves, what's important about a butcher shop? A Yiddish butcher shop. Why should any artist want to do that? What great concept is being presented here? Well, the idea of the Neo-Dadists was, it's not a great concept. This is just our experiences of life. This is things we've seen in our environment, and we think that they can be a subject in art. And so he takes a plate glass window. It actually has Hebrew writing on it to announce, that it is a butcher shop. Gives us that. These are actually the kinds of rods that were hung in the windows of butcher shops, and then they would hang geese and ducks and chickens by the neck, from these to display them for sale. And so in that way, it's just like, things he's experienced in his life. But then what he did to make the statement or to really tell people, this is about art also, even though it's daily life I'm showing, he decided to use these ghostly sort of figures. He would make plaster figures. He eventually will use actual models. He'll, make molds of the models and then, change them into plastic. And he would leave them unpainted at first. So you would see something like this, and your first thought might be, oh yeah, I saw this in the street the other day. I passed by a butcher shop like that. And then you would see the white figure and you'd say, oh, wait a minute. This is different. This isn't just like what I saw. And so that was supposed to then make you start thinking about, well, what is he doing? Why is this art? How is this art? And to really make you start thinking about art. Eventually, he did begin to add some color to some of the figures, but he still didn't try to depict them exactly as they looked. It was still sort of splashy kind of color that it would use. So he was one example of an artist that begins to deal with this idea about art of real life that John Cage had talked about in some of his writings. Klaus Oldenburg is another one. I'll have to adjust this. I didn't realize this was going to be cut off. This says Klaus Oldenburg, and the title of this work is The Store. And the date of it is, I'm not sure, I think it's 1961 is the date for it. Klaus Oldenburg went from those happenings that he first participated in into beginning to create ordinary objects out of other materials. For example, he's holding here in his hand something that looks sort of like a piece of iced cake. He began to make food out of paper mache. Then he went to rubber and plaster. At the very beginning, they were fabric. He would come up with the ideas and sort of sketch them out, and then his wife would actually sew them and create them. And he decided, since they were ordinary sorts of objects that he was making, out of these different materials, he decided that what he'd do is rent an empty store in New York City and open it up like it was a real store, like he was presenting products for sale. Products had been manufactured, but they'd really been all made, by his wife from his ideas. So we see him holding a piece of, a cake here. He had other kinds of things. This is one of the cases in the store showing different kinds of food. Here's a full cake with here's an apple that's had a bite taken out of it. He also duplicated women's hosiery and other sorts of objects and would sell them in the store. People would come in and buy them. They thought they were very unusual because here they were the same size and they looked very much like food, and yet you knew it wasn't something that you could really eat. And from that, he was asked to show his works in a gallery in California, and he didn't want to just repeat himself. So he began to think, okay, what can I do that's different? He knew wanted this work, but he didn't want to just repeat himself. So what he decided to do, instead of making them the actual size that they would be if we saw them, in a store, he decided he would make them, 3, 4, 5, 10 times as large. And so this is a black and white photograph that was taken of this exhibit. And again, his art is often called an environment because he really creates an environment for his art. First the store. It was a real store that he then populated with all these objects that had been made. And then when he began to show them in gallery settings, you would see these gigantic, this is an ice cream cone that we're looking at here. In the back, we have a hamburger with a pickle that he's made. This is a slice of cake, and they're all very large scale. You can sort of tell by, judging, their size against the wall, the floorboards here, and the molding and the wall here in the background. And I have a couple of examples in color. Over here, we have a bacon and lettuce and tomato sandwich. And over here, we have falling shoestring potatoes that were hung on the wall. So then he began to create this really large-scale works. And what his art began to be about was contradictions. If something was, a certain size, he would enlarge it. He did this not just with food. He also took the kind of electrical switches that we see on the wall. He made them really large. He took small clothespins, and he would make them as tall as a 5-story building. And so one of the contradictions he began to work with was the idea of taking, and these are ordinary objects. I can remember the first time I saw him, and I looked at it, and it was like I was confused. I said, well, it's a hamburger. Even though I knew and I could see it was a large hamburger, my mind still said, it's a hamburger. How is this art? Well, it was art because this generation of artists thought of ordinary things as being as valuable as anything that you could make that wouldn't look, like a common everyday object. And so he would enlarge it, and so you knew immediately, well, it's got to be art, even though you might not really understand why he was doing it. He would take soft things and make them hard. He would take hard things and make them soft. And here, for example, is another very famous work that he created. It's called the soft toilet. He took the image of a toilet, and toilets are made out of porcelain. They're very hard. And he made it look like they were very soft. At this point in time, he's working with vinyl for the material that he used. And he made it look very soft, as if gravity were actually sort of pulling it down and distorting its form. And of course, that doesn't happen with with porcelain toilets. So he liked these contradictions, and it allowed him to work with ordinary objects, that he found in the environment, and yet somehow change them so people had to look at them again and say, okay, that's not just a toilet. That's an artist's impression or his expression of what a toilet is like to him. Or, you had to say, this is art, because he's created it. So Oldenburg was another of these early artists that began to, say, and the abstract expressionists hated them. They thought that they were not making art, they were just making kitsch. It was not worthy of being shown in museums. And yet they were saying, well, you don't always have to be so neurotic and always have to have this abstract art. Notice that they've returned to representational images, even though they're treating them a lot differently. They're representational. And the abstract expressionists had condemned representation. They'd said, no, great art is about non-objective art. It's about feelings. It's about not showing things that are recognizable. And these artists begin to return to recognizable sorts of images, even though, they're doing something with them. They're somehow changing them a great deal. These are some of the latest works, or the last works that Claes Oldenburg has been doing. He just kept moving up in size and scale. The one that you're seeing over here on the right is the first one listed, called Lipstick Ascending a Caterpillar Trailer. He was asked by a group of students, and I'm trying to remember, it's one of the Ivy League colleges. I believe it was Yale, if I remember right, to create something for a Vietnam War protest that they were going to take part in. And so he, since it was about war, he decided to create something that would vaguely look like a tank. You sort of get that vague sense of, this would be where the tracks would be on a tank. This would be that big barrel of the tank that would stick out. Except instead of it being actually a barrel, he made it into a lipstick. And it would move. It could be horizontal, or it could move up to this vertical position that you see here. And so he made this for this Vietnam War protest. The head of the college, Yale University at the time, hated it, thought it was an insult, insisted that this be taken down or removed immediately, and it was. And then later on, when Klaus Oldenburg became famous, then Yale University wanted it back. And so now it is at Yale University. Here is the last one that I've listed here. This is called the knife ship. And again, he took something ordinary. This is a Swiss Army knife, is what it is. And it has the corkscrew in it, has the different blades that move up. And again, this does move. And he decided that the general outline of this kind of shape reminded him of the ships like the Vikings had, where they had all the oars and everyone sat inside of them and rowed the ships. And so he added these oars to the side. The oars move, the blades open up and close up, the corkscrew comes out. And this was displayed, in the Guggenheim Museum. That's what you're seeing here in the background. And so in his later work, he began to work on very large scale, but still using often common sorts of objects, and then, just doing something to them which would call attention to them and make us think about, how is this art, and, why is he creating this sort of thing. Another artist that belongs to this Neo-Dada group is Jasper Johns. And he became known for creating images of the American flag. This one that you see here, he also did one that was entirely white. He did one where he had nested flags. He had 3 different sizes, one on top of the other, going from larger to smaller. And what he said he was doing, again, the idea is he's taking something we all recognize. It's very common. Nobody has any difficulty seeing it. It's American flag. And he said the reason he did it was just for that reason. Everybody knew what it was. So then the artwork didn't have to be what it was. It didn't have to be subject matter, and that didn't have to be the main importance, but rather what he was trying to get you to do was think about why did he do it in this way? Why did he take that American flag? He also used encaustic. That's the material we talked about for painting. It's made of beeswax with pigment in it. So some of this roughness of the surface is because of the encaustic that he used to paint this. And so, on the one hand, he knew that we'd look at it, we'd say, well, that's American flag. And on the other hand, the way that he painted it, it would say, but that's not just exactly like the American flag that we're used to. It's not made out of the same sort of materials. And so it made us, again, sort of try to figure out what is he talking about? Why is he using this American flag? And as I said, he said because it's a common object. Everybody knows immediately what it is. So then if they look at this, they will evaluate, or they'll look at how I painted it and how it relates to its background, all of that, rather than trying to figure out what the subject matter is, because everybody will know what the subject matter is. He also did targets, such as you see here, and sometimes would put different parts of human beings up in little compartments. These are all lids that can close down over these different areas, and so that you don't see them, and so you really concentrate just on the target. But when you open them, in one example that he created of this, they're all heads, human heads. And so that immediately creates sort of a danger element to this, because you look at the target and you immediately think of target practice, of, using an arrow or using a gun or, doing something and shooting at this, or a dart even. And, as often happens when you're shooting at a target, the arrow strays away or the dart, strays away. It doesn't hit right in the center. And so by placing parts of human beings up here, it's sort of implied they might be hit. They might be harmed by this. And again, the idea was, first of all, choose a common object, just something very common, so that people look at how I painted it and people ask questions, why did I choose this very common sort of object? He worked for a while in the same studio with another man that we're going to look at for Neo-Dadaism. But first of all, I wanted to show you an example of sculpture that Jasper Johns created. This is called bronze, painted bronze. It's beer cans. All he did was just copy beer cans exactly, except they're made out of bronze. They're not actual beer cans. So again, he's created them to look like beer cans. And so, the emphasis is on the fact that they're a very common object that we could see, thrown away in any trash can anywhere. But they're made of a material that costs a lot, that's very precious. And so the question becomes, okay, why would he think beer cans were worthy of being represented as artwork? Why would he use this expensive material to make such a mundane, sort of object? The man that he worked with is a man named Robert Rauschenberg. I thought Robert was on here. You see his name partially up here, concealed by this work that you see here. Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns both studied at Black Mountain College, so they were able to talk to John Cage about his different ideas about art, and that influenced both of them in deciding to choose ordinary sorts of objects. At one point in his life, Robert Rauschenberg was very poor, and he didn't have money to buy any new canvas or materials to serve as the surface for his painting, and so he decided to take the materials off of his own bed. And so these are the actual sheets and the pillow, the quilt blanket that he used on his bed, and then he splashed and sort of smeared paint on it. Again, the idea, the smearing sort of splashy paint was sort of his way of paying homage to abstract expression and how they applied paint, but at the same time, since he applied it to a bed, since we can recognize it's a blanket, or quilt, it's a sheet, there's a pillow there. Immediately he was saying, no, art can be something else. It doesn't have to be all that abstract stuff, that very personal sort of stuff like the abstract expressionists were using. This can be about life, just representing objects of life. It does have, people have often mentioned, it sort of looks violent because the paint, the way it's sort of splashed around, it almost looks like somebody's been murdered in this bed or something. He never said that was his actual meaning for it, but it may have, he may have realized that that's what it would eventually be. I don't see the title to that. It's probably cut off at the bottom. I'll have to put this on the file when I put it in onto Blackboard. This is called Monogram by Robert Rauschenberg, created about 1959, I believe is the date of it. And again, it's the idea of just taking random objects, whatever's available, and doing something with it, making it into something artistic. And what he said about this goat was that he was walking in the streets of New York and happened to walk past a secondhand store, and he just thought it was so ridiculous. He looked in the store window, and there was this goat standing there, staring at him, a stuffed goat. And he said it was so unusual, to see a goat in New York City, that he went in and he bought it, and he took it home, not with the idea of that he would use it necessarily, or he didn't have anything planned at the time. He just thought it was such an unusual object to see. And then later on, he took this stuffed goat, added a tire, automobile tire that he wrapped around it. And then he stood it on a wooden base, and this wooden base is made up of different pieces of found objects. The Neo-Dadists get their name partially because they are doing things that are similar to Dada artists that we looked at. We talked about Marcel Duchamp and how he would take ordinary, everyday objects, manufactured objects, and he'd use it, for his art. And so the Neo-Dadists sort of got that idea, of using these everyday objects, taking bits and pieces of stuff they would find in the gutters or on the streets of New York, and then taking all those things and constructing compositions. And so he, creates this composition out of all of this junk that he finds. Then he added, the goat, and he added the tire around the goat. He even splashed some paint onto the face. And again, the idea is that this is just ordinary objects that you could see anywhere in the city of New York or any place else, for that matter. Not so much the goat as, tires that we can't seem to dispose of, and bits and pieces of wood. And it's as if he's saying, and why can't that be art? Why can't I use something like that and make it art? He also had a concept. He would take he'd take a certain period of time, like maybe he would take a week, and everything he found within that week, he would then put into an artwork. And he said what those artworks were about just my life for a week. This is what I saw for a week. And I picked up to be a document or sort of evidence of that week, and then I put it all together. And he tried to ignore composition, traditional kinds of composition. It's still there, but he didn't particularly want to emphasize that he had an ordered sort of composition. He just simply was saying, this is just things I saw all week. And then I made a painting out of them, or I made a sculpture out of them, like you see here. He called them combines, not meaning, any kind of agricultural vehicle, but by combine he just took that word of combining things together and said, this is what I'm doing. I just made something that's combined together. It doesn't have any other meaning other than it's just my week and the things that I found. He also experimented with silk screening, and we did look at this when we were talking about printmaking. He used silk screen, he used some photographic transfer processes. And again, you get that sense that these are just scattered images, just different things that happened to him during the week, and he just put them all together, to create a composition. What the Neo-Dada artists were doing, to some extent, was saying, we don't care about traditional rules of art or, things that people have done in the past. We're creating new kinds of art, using new kinds of ideas. And one of the ideas was this idea of using common everyday things or images that they saw in life and making that a part of art. So this whole generation, this beat generation of artists, responded, to abstract expression, and they influenced the pop artists that were developing about the same period of time. And there are many pop artists. I've just listed the 4 that I'm going to show you examples of. Andy Warhol is probably the most famous of the pop artists. Roy Lichtenstein is also very famous. And then James Rosenberg, Tom Wesselman are a little bit less well known than Warhol and Lichtenstein. And here you have examples. Down here is the image that we've looked at before by Warhol of the 200 Campbell soup cans. And this is one of Roy Lichtenstein's images called Wham. The pop artists, instead of just taking junk or whatever they happen to pick up around the street, they became interested in media and how important media was to the United States and actually the world at this time. And so each of the pop artists tended to feature one particular media. For example, Andy Warhol became very interested in commercial art, commercial products. like Campbell soup cans. He also did a painting of Coca-Cola bottles. And the idea, of them is, and we've talked a little bit about this already. We were talking about composition, principles of design. One of his things he was trying to express in, creating these Campbell soup cans in the way that he does, just repeating them, with very little variation. He was really trying to talk to us about what modern life is like, that it's rather boring. It doesn't matter what grocery store you walk into, whether it's in the United States or it's in Russia or it's in China or where it is, you're going to find Campbell soup cans. And so all over the world, this American culture has sort of been spread. And he felt like we'd lost something in the process. We had lost that sort of individuality of different countries. And we'd lost their particular customs and habits. Everyone was beginning to look like Americans. And he thought it was boring. And he thought it was very monotonous. And so, by creating something where there's very little variation, where it just mostly looks the same, where it doesn't matter if you look at this one, or you look at this one, or you look at this one, you're basically seeing everything else by looking at one of those cans. And then that way he could say, isn't this boring? And so that was sort of one of his approaches that he took. I'll talk about another one that he also took with the media in a minute. What Lichtenstein did was to take cartoon images that were printed in the newspapers or in comic books, and that sort of became his subject matter. In both cases, it's still common objects. It's everyday sorts of objects that are being used. And Lichtenstein just liked to, take images. He didn't copy exactly, although they are at times very close to cartoon images. He would always do something, change them somehow. And what you can't really see here in this image is that the way that it's created exactly the way that you would have seen colored comics at that time. They use Ben-Day dots. They use dots of color. And so his work looks sort of pixelated. It's not as smooth and continuous in areas of color as it looks like here in this slide. It's actually made up of little dots of color that he used, sort of like pixelation. And that's because that was how the color printing was done at that time. And he also defined, the images that he was creating by this black line. Again, this was something that was being used in cartoons and comic books at this time. So in other words, he's taking, the kind of commercial images that were seen in newspapers and comic books and reproducing it on a very large scale. And what all of these pop artists were saying was, why can't this be art? Again, the abstract expressionists hated what they were doing because, one, it had representation, and two, it looked so sterile, it looked so objective. There wasn't any personal emotion, and it looked just like the media they were copying. And the abstract expressionists said, but that's graphic design, or, that belongs somewhere else. That's not fine art. The other two artists that I had listed there took other elements of popular media. James Lichtenstein created images that were billboard size. He actually, when he had first begun to try to become a famous artist, and to make a living with art, he had worked as putting up billboards in New York and in Chicago and other places. And so when he did become successful, that continued to be the way that he sort of treated his art. What he noticed was, and what used to happen, they would just simply paste one large sheet of an image over an earlier image. And so at times you'd have these two images together that didn't look like they went together at all, and sometimes they had very strange kind of connotations. And I'll show you in a minute when we look at some other details of this particular work that he did here, how they do, come out looking strange, having strange sorts of connotations. Then Tom Wesselman just simply took Playboy. Playboy appears in the 60s. He simply took those frontal sort of nude images of women presented, very objectively in Playboy, and presented them as his image. So he took Playboy and similar kinds of magazines like that and used that as the basis for his images. Warhol also took celebrities. He's the one who made the comment one time that everyone will be famous for 15 minutes, and actually it's probably even less than that nowadays. He understood, that celebrities were often treated as if they didn't have human emotions, they didn't have human feelings. After Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, or possibly, we don't know, it may have been an accidental overdose of sleeping pills combined with alcohol. Right after she died, he did a whole series. I showed you a diptych that he did. He also did this one where it's just a single image of her on a gold background. And he was really evaluating, what does celebrity mean? What does it mean to be a celebrity? How long are you famous? How do people treat you if you're a celebrity? Do they really care about you, or are they just mostly concerned about themselves, being able to shake your hand or get your autograph or stand beside you while somebody takes a picture? Do they really care about the celebrity as a human being? And he felt, I think he sympathized with Marilyn Monroe because she had become such a sex symbol at this time that she felt that people didn't really think much of her as an actress and didn't give her much respect as an actress, and she was a very good actress. That they mostly just looked at how she looked, and that's all that they admired about her, was just her looks. And when she had this accidental overdose, she had reached about mid-30s, and people who knew her said she was starting to worry that if people only liked her for her beauty or her appearance, that was going to start going. And she would, lose her fortune, she'd lose her fame if they didn't respect her, for being an actress also. And so, Andy Warhol was very interested in celebrity, this concept of what is a celebrity. He also was a very religious man. People don't often know about that. He was an Eastern Orthodox Christian. He went to Mass every day. And the way that he treats her here is almost as if she's an icon. In the Eastern Church, there are images that are made and that have been made for centuries that usually show just the head or the upper torso and head of saints, the Virgin Mary, Jesus. And these are religious works that are often in the homes of the people. And so he sort of wanted to, he was saying to us that, we almost treat celebrities as if they're religious, as if they're some kind of holy, person. And so he presents her here, just like the one image would be presented of Jesus or Mary, puts a gold background, and often these Eastern Orthodox images would have a gold background to indicate it was heaven. And so it's almost like he's treating her like a saint here, or he's saying, that's the way modern society sort of treats people like this, as if they're saints. So this was another sort of modern element of life that he was very interested in. He also did sculptures. He took, just ordinary boxes that had been used to ship Kellogg's cornflakes or Brillo pads, and these are reconstructed. He didn't just take the actual boxes and present those in a gallery setting. He would, because they were made of cardboard, rather flimsy cardboard, so he would make these out of wood. But in every other way, they look exactly like the boxes that, people would see in grocery stores when they were unloading, a new load of some produce that had been brought in. So he does the same sort of thing with boxes as well. Lichtenstein, as I said, concentrates on comics, and he really liked war comics and romance comics. And so here you see an image that is supposed to represent a romance comic. He actually got into this when he had a small son challenge him to make an image from a comic book. The son had, I guess, he had been an abstract expressionist painter before that, and I guess the son didn't understand what he was painting, and maybe the son thought it looked very messy and it didn't look like art to him, because art to him was what was in the comics. And so he challenged his dad to create an image similar to a comic, and then this happened to be shown to a gallery dealer, and the gallery dealer said, "Oh, you've got something here. You know, nobody's doing something like this. Why don't you do this?" And so that's how he got into making these comic book sorts of images. And they're very stylized, you know, the appearance of the woman here with a very sharp nose and the perfect eyelashes. And the men, you know, always look very handsome and very well developed. And he sort of exaggerates, you know, this is they're supposed to be in water. And so this is the shadow on the water that we're seeing here, and he makes it a very hard sort of line. And again, you know, like he did in the Wham, he, you know, emphasizes those black outlines. So he specialized in cartoons of various sorts. Rosenquist, as I said, specialized in billboards, and here shows you the entire image that we saw just a clip of before. This covered 4 walls of a room of an art gallery. So it's, you know, and it was from floor to ceiling. So it's very large. It's like a billboard in size. And it shows those juxtapositions of things, how, you know, 2 subjects come together that aren't supposed to have any relationship, and yet because they're together, they sort of set up a strange kind of relationship. For example, when we were looking at the other example, there's a little girl here underneath. This is the kind of old hair dryers that they had in the 1960s. But notice that the hair dryer shape is very much like the cone of an airplane. And you actually see the cone of the airplane right down here, and the projecting piece off of that cone. And so he's making these connections between similar kinds of shapes that have very different meaning. You know, the hairdryer is just, you know, and it's a child. So, you know, what he's trying to say is there's nothing dangerous about this image. You know, she's just going to get her hair dried. But this image of the F-11, 111, is what this cone here is. That was a warplane. That was very dangerous. And actually at this time there was quite a controversy about the F-11. There were problems with it. And so there was a lot of talk about it. And then he superimposes, you know, this warplane nose over an image of spaghetti, you know, something like you'd buy in a can at the store. Except when you connect it, you know, with this warplane, and just by it being by overlapping that spaghetti, it sort of makes that connection. Then it creates a kind of a strange interpretation. You know, is that spaghetti? Is that some human body that's sort of been turned into, you know, just pieces of flesh? And is that blood instead of spaghetti sauce that we're looking at here? So, you know, what he had noticed was that when you were changing one image for another in billboards, that often these strange sorts of comparisons came up, and it was almost like something was controlling these images from outside, you know, and trying to send us messages, trying to tell us something about life. This element right here sort of looks like the explosion of a bomb. At least that's the way people have interpreted it. So, you know, he is talking about, he became quite active in the anti-war movement, in protesting against the Vietnam War. And so many of his images at this particular time had to do with, you know, danger and with the problems that occur in war. This is just to give you a sense of how large it is. Here's part of this image here, and then here's the child once again with the hairdryer above her head. Most pop artists were in New York City. And so New York City began to sort of get the name of the center of art, the place that all young artists wanted to go to. But that made other artists in other parts of the country rather angry often. And so there was a strong group that developed in Chicago. This is just one of the leaders of the group that I'm showing you here. They created a slightly different kind of pop art. They aren't as interested in the various media. They're not trying to reproduce advertising or comic books. They have more connection with some of those happenings, that they're taking just ordinary sorts of objects and then putting things together and coming up with very strange kinds of images like you see here by Westerman. So there are pop artists that are using common everyday objects that come from real life, but they're not emphasizing that commercialism and the celebrity and the media the way that the pop artists are that were in New York. And then there was another group of artists working on the West Coast. And they've often been called West Coast pop, but I actually like another name for them better. They're also called funk artists. And here's one of the images by one of these funk artists. It's called The Child. And, it has a child's high chair, so it has that common everyday object that we would see, in many homes during that time. But then, he's put this image of a child in it. He's stretched this sort of gauzy-like material over it as if this is cobwebs, and that's what I usually think of when I look at this, that, the child it seems to be dead, he seems to be sort of decaying, look at how the face is all distorted, and he seems to have been sitting there so long that the spiders are beginning to cover him with cobwebs. So the funk artists tend to choose kind of disturbing kinds of images for their art. Not all of them are quite as disturbing as this, but this is their approach that they take towards this pop art that's developing at this time. A very well-known ceramic artist was Robert Arneson, and he made everyday sorts of objects out of clay. But again, he always did something a little weird, a little strange about them. For example, here, these are supposed to be the keys of a typewriter that you're looking at, or today, he would have probably taken a computer. But notice that the keys are all the ends of the fingers. So he's making that connection. People will use their fingers to push down these keys, so I'm just going to paint the keys as fingers. And so he was an artist that was working on the West Coast that really begins to take ceramics and to say it doesn't have to be just pots. It can be used in different ways. It's not just a craft material, which is the way it was usually seen up to this time. It can be used for art objects. It can be used for things that make comments that get you to think, about why they're made in the way that they're made. Another artist that is a funk artist on the West Coast is a man named Edward Kienholz. And this particular work is called Barney's Dinery. The figures are about 1/3 life-size. And this was a very famous restaurant in Los Angeles that he's depicting here. And so he's, tried to be rather faithful at the way he's depicted it. He made, the bar here and the kind of stools they're sitting on look very much like what Barney's Eatery would actually be. And he's dressed the figures in similar kinds of clothing that they would wear. The one thing that's different, you can see that here, for example, on this head or here. All of the heads are clocks. And they're all stopped at exactly the same time. And so he seems to be, sort of saying, and his work's been interpreted in a lot of different ways, that one may be that these people feel so run by the clocks, that they only have so long to eat lunch, and then they've got to run back, to their jobs. And so their life is all about time. It's all about being somewhere at a particular time. So that's one way in which this has been interpreted. Another way that I think you could also interpret it, considering, that the people at the beginning of the 60s are still concerned about the Cold War and about the Soviet Union having bombs. It's almost as if he said, all the clocks stopped at the same exact hour when the bomb was dropped. And that may be another interpretation. He didn't like to give interpretations. He liked other people to take whatever ideas they had and to sort of insert them, put them in to their art. And he liked to take, ordinary circumstances. He did like to send messages to people. There's another work of art that I haven't shown you. I used to show it in class. It's called State Hospital, and it actually is a little barred room with old cast iron beds in it, and it's a representation of what state hospitals looked like at that time. State hospitals were places where people that had mental illnesses were placed. And in the early 60s, they were mostly just sort of caged and left. They really didn't have very many treatments for them. And so he liked to take things like that he saw problems in society, and he liked to show his art, or use his art to show those problems in the society. Now, we've been looking at artists that react to abstract expression by saying art can be representational, it can be more objective, not so much about personal emotion, or it can send messages to people. It's not just about your emotions and yourself. It can actually be used to try and change things in society. There's another group of artists that develop at the same time that pop is developing. And these artists are called minimalists or minimalism. And in a way, what they're doing is they're following the abstract expressions. They're following that trend of the early 20th century of creating non-objective sort of art. And here are a number of the artists that I'm going to show you that have worked in this trend. Some of them may be dead. I know Robert Ryman's still alive. I think Tony Smith has died now, and I just don't have his dates. And I'm not sure about Carl Andre. Frank Stella is still alive. Frank Stella is thought of as one of the first artists to create minimalism. And the work that you see over here on the right is by Frank Stella. He was influenced by the stripe effect that he saw in Jasper Johns' art, in the flags that Jasper Johns had created. Except Frank Stella said, why does it have to be about flags? Why does it have to be about a subject? Why can't it just be about art? And these minimalist artists, the reason they get their name is they decide that what art should be is just to tell you what art does. That an artist uses paint, or that an artist makes certain arrangements. It's not about representation. They're still non-objective artists. But it's also not about nature anymore. When we looked at Mondrian and we looked at the Russian artists, they all said that what they were creating was a response to nature. They were creating a response to life. These artists say, no, we're not doing that. We're not interested in that. All we want to do is we want to show you art. We want you to look at something and think about art. Nothing else, not some religion or not everyday life or, nothing else. Just think about art. And so what they begin to do is they begin to eliminate things from art. Anything that they think makes a reference outside of art to nature or to representation, they want to eliminate it. And that's how they got that name of being minimalist artists. And so Frank Stella is one of the first that begins to work. And he works just with stripes of color, that all seem to sort of come together right here in the center. This is a radial composition. I showed you one in color when I talked about, radial balance, that all the sides are equal. There's no difference, between top or bottom or side to side. They're all the same. He even went so far as the sizes of these strips were exactly the same as the wood strips he used to stretch his canvas. Everything was exactly the same size. So the minimalists begin, to try and create a very pure sort of art. They also write a lot. I think they write a lot because they know nobody's going to understand what they're doing if they don't write about it. And I have some problems with that. I think you ought to be able to look at a piece of art and try to figure out something the artist is trying to do. If you can't figure it out, and if they've got to write about it, then why didn't they just write in the first place? Why are they a visual artist? So I have a little problem with minimalism. He also then began to create sort of shaped canvases. Again, it was as if he said, why do they always have to be square or rectangular? Why can't they be unusual shapes, like this? This is very large. It's 18 feet long by 6.5 feet wide. And I have to say that you may have gotten the impression from what I just said that I don't like minimalism, and I do have problems with it. But his works, these large works like this, when you see them in a museum, they are really impressive. They're so gigantic, they really do create an impact in the viewer, but they're still very simple, and they're all based upon these stripes. And when the stripe turns, then he says to himself, I've got to make the shape of the canvas turn too. And so again, that's the only thing that drives this art. It's not about anything else, even though he gives titles to them. And this is called the Empress of India, but it's not really about India. It's not about any visual image. It's not about any story from India. It's just a title, that he gives to it. He has changed from this style. This is what he became famous for in the 60s. But nowadays, he's creating things like this. They're very large. Again, this is 12 feet by 10 feet, the size of it. Instead of being very clean, with those straight lines and all the color very carefully controlled between those lines of the stripes that we just looked at, this looks very messy. There's lots of movement in the way that he applies the paint and the different kind of images. There's none of that repetition, or very little, repetition anymore. So he's moved away from minimalism, and his style is called maximalism just because he's doing everything he didn't do before. These also have other materials attached. It's a little hard to tell, but these are actually metal rods that are painted red that he's attached to the surface. So they're not just flat surfaces. And so you have much more movement, much more texture in these works. They're very large. They're very expensive. I once saw him on a TV show where they were talking about how art was sold, and they used him as an example. This dealer that sells his works brought this client to Frank Stella's studio to look at some of these works that he was creating. And the person that was brought to the studio asked how much they cost, and Frank Stella said, if you have to ask me how much they cost, you can't afford them. These sell for up to $1 million a piece. Another artist that worked in minimalism is a man named Robert Ryman. Here you see a series of his paintings. Here you see one, again, that has a little bit more expression in the edges. You actually see sort of the edges of the paint, and you get a sense of the brush stroke that maybe applied the paint. And he has experimented with different sorts of things, such as this, but he's probably best known for these very simple paintings like you see here on the wall. And I'm going to show you a detail of a set of them. They're always the same size. The way he attaches them to the wall is as important as the actual works themselves, because the way he attaches them, it raises them up a little bit off the wall, so it gives them a certain amount of dimension. But they're very simple. They're all white. He believed that if you used any other colors on these, then that tended to de-emphasize their flatness, and he wanted to emphasize that they were flat. He thought it suggested that there was space, depth, if there were other colors. And he thinks that depth is a part of life, and so it's something that you have to eliminate because these are about art, not life. Again, these are things that I've had difficulty. I understand them intellectually. I have difficulty appreciating them. I once saw an exhibit of his art in an art gallery, and it was simply wall after wall of white canvases, all the same size, exactly like you're seeing here. And I just made a sarcastic comment to the person I was with that I was going to go home and I was going to buy my son lots of white paint. We were going to start making money. I was just going to have him roller, all these canvases. Of course he wouldn't have because he's not famous like Robert Ryman is, but Ryman does make a lot of money with these. In sculpture, and minimalism actually developed into a style that's mostly thought of as being sculptural. In sculpture, they also worked with very simple geometric sorts of shapes, one flat color. Tony Smith is one of the first of these minimalist artists to develop, and this is a very famous work that he did called Die. It's 6 feet high, 6 feet across. All the sides are 6 feet, in every dimension. It doesn't look like that. It looks more rectangular here, but that's just the distortion of the slide. And so, again, it's a very simple work. You simply respond to it in a three-dimensional sort of way because it blocks you. You can't walk through it. You can't walk around. I mean, you have to walk around it. It becomes very three-dimensional in that way. And so he began, to create these simple geometric sorts of shapes, and that led to this artist that we've seen before. His name is Donald Judd. He does a series of shapes. He takes the same simple sorts of shapes. In this case, he created empty boxes. You can actually see through the insides of these. Maybe you can tell a little bit from this. He paints the insides, but they're empty. They're hollow, so they're just the voids. He created this box, and he likes to work in series, and so he would sometimes, run them vertically up a wall. You just have a series of the same thing. The idea of serialism, the idea of things being always the same and just repeated, has a connection with our culture. Again, our commercial culture where we produce hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the same thing. And so the artist thought, okay, why don't we do that with art? Let's create hundreds and hundreds of the same sort of shape. What's the difference? People like these commercial products. Why wouldn't they like, this kind of a product in art? So the ones that we've seen are larger boxes. I've shown you this before that he created. He creates very large-scale ones as well. The ones that are shown here, this is a museum. It's an old hangar from a World War II air base that he bought. And he shows his work in there, and you can see that they are also empty. Sometimes they have roofs on them, so you can't see into them. But often he likes to work with that idea of having this hollow space that you see inside of them. But again, they're just the same shape, same treatment of surface, same color in just a series, of works, as you can see here. Okay, I think we'll stop right here. I'd still have to talk about Carl Andre, but we'll talk about him next time and talk about some other styles in the late 20th century.